Welcome back, everyone. Today we're making a 40-liter hiking backpack. This bag measures in at 21 by 12 with an 8.5-inch depth, and it can also be collapsed down into a pocket bag that measures 8 by 10. And I packed a lot of extra features on this bag, overall making it an awesome bag for hiking, day bag, or even traveling. But with all that being said, if you're new to the channel, grab that printable pattern and let's get started. Getting started with supplies, you're gonna wanna grab yourself 1 3/4 yards for your main fabric, and I highly recommend grabbing a nylon. This is a great lightweight, durable fabric that you can pretty much use on all hiking equipment, or you can also use the typical fabrics I recommend, canvas, denim, or twill. I'm actually gonna be using a mix of nylon and denim, and this is gonna be the acid wash denim. And if you wanna see how I acid wash the denim, go and check out my Instagram or my TikTok. I made a short little detailed video on there going through the process of acid washing the denim. But I'm gonna mix it up. I like using both of these fabrics together. I think it really brings out a different look. So you can totally use whatever fabrics you want. You'll need 3 yards of 3/4 inch to 1 inch webbing. Going along with this webbing, you'll also need buckles and strap adjusters. So whatever size webbing you pick, you're gonna wanna match your hardware. So if you have 3/4 inch webbing, you're also gonna wanna have 3/4 inch strap adjusters and buckles. And I'm gonna be using 3/4 inch all the way around. We'll also be adding a buckle up front connecting the straps, but we'll get to this later on. You'll need 3 zippers, one 12 inch, one 26 inch, and one 32 inch. And I'd recommend going above these sizes because we're gonna be snipping the ends. I'm actually gonna be working with a zipper roll. This is the best way I found to work with zippers. You can get precisely the zipper you want with minimal waste. You'll need 1 yard of elastic, and this is gonna be for the front elastic holder. This is an optional feature. If you do decide to go with this and add the elastic, you're also gonna need 6 1/2-inch D-rings, and you can use D-rings or regular rings. You'll also need 1 cord stopper, and the cord stopper can be any style. We're gonna be using a double hole cord stopper, and also a smaller webbing or leather strips. I'm gonna be using leather strips to attach the D-ring to the bag. I personally like the look of the leather, but feel free to use whatever that works best for you. You'll need 1 snap button. I'm gonna be using a magnetic snap button. I use these in a lot of projects. They're super simple to install and look really nice. Lastly, you'll need your pattern. This pattern is available at properfitclothing.com. It's super simple to use. All you have to do is print it out, tape it together, and you're ready to go. And before you tape it together, the best thing to do is cut off the top and one of the side edges. This is gonna allow you to overlap the pages to make for a perfectly aligned pattern. Once you have all your supplies gathered and your pattern printed out, it's time to move into cutting.
And after taping your pattern together, it should look like this. For the best results, be sure to check your printer alignment so your pages print off square and overlap correctly. Cut out the pattern and make sure you cut 4 strap panels out of your main fabric, 1 front pocket backside zipper panel out of your main fabric on the fold, 1 front pocket front side zipper panel out of your main fabric on the fold, 2 front side pocket panels out of your main fabric, 2 main flat panels out of your main fabric, 1 front pocket bottom side panel out of your main fabric on the fold, 2 back pocket bottom back side panels out of your main fabric, 1 back pocket main bottom side panel out of your main fabric, 2 bottom side strap panels out of your main fabric, 1 back pocket top bottom panel out of your main fabric, 2 back pocket bottom front side panels out of your main fabric, 1 back pocket front zipper panel out of your main fabric on the fold, 1 back pocket back zipper panel out of your main fabric on the fold, 1 front center pocket panel out of your main fabric, 1 front pocket lining panel out of your main fabric, 1 main front pocket panel out of your main fabric, 1 inside pocket top panel out of your main fabric, 1 inside pocket bottom panel out of your main fabric, 1 front pocket divider panel out of your main fabric, and lastly 1 main back panel out of your main fabric. Moving on to construction, grab your front center pocket panel, evenly mark the elastic loop placement guides on both sides of the panel, grab your 1/2-inch D-ring and leather strips or webbing, whatever you want to hold it with, and we're going to place these on our placement guides. I like to hang mine off the edge about 1/4 to 1/2 an inch, and do one at a time. I'm going to stitch as close as I can to the edge, making sure I keep them as even as possible. And if you don't plan on adding elastic, you can skip this step. Grab the front side pocket panel, and we're going to place these on top of the leather strips with right sides together. When you have the two panels evenly lined up, we're going to stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And it can be a little bit tricky keeping that panel in position as you're sewing over the leather, so I recommend pinning it down before you start sewing. After stitching, flip the right sides up, and we're going to add a top stitch to both of those new edges. And I think it's easiest folding the seam allowance towards the front side panel and stitching directly on the front side panel. And these will be on the front of your bag, so definitely try to keep them as neat as possible. This will also add a little bit of strength for your elastic loops. Grab the front pocket lining panel, and we're going to place the right sides together and stitch the top edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. After finishing up the stitch, flip the wrong sides together, lining up the top edge, and we're going to add a top stitch. Since I'm using two different fabrics, I'm only stitching the middle section, but I recommend stitching the entire edge if you're only using one fabric. Grab your main front pocket panel and your complete front pocket. We're going to place that complete front pocket on the bottom edge and sew them together using a serger. This step is optional. You can use a zigzag stitch or a straight stitch. I'm just attaching both these layers together so it's easier to assemble later on. If you are using a straight stitch, just stitch as close as you can to the outside edge. Double check all the layers, and we can place the front assembly off to the side. Grab our front pocket flap panels, place the right sides together, and we're going to stitch the bottom edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And after stitching the bottom edge, we're going to flip the right sides out, and just like we did in the previous steps, we're going to use pins to line up that bottom edge and add a top stitch. Take your time and try to make it as neat as possible. After finishing, we're going to grab the pattern again and mark out our button placement on our front side. Once you're satisfied with your marking, we're going to cut or punch out our hole. Grab your closure. I'm using a magnetic closure, so I'm going to start with the thinner side. I typically start with this side on the top, slide it through our hole from the back side of the panel. And these buttons have a back end, so I'm going to grab that back end and place it on the back side of the closure. And the last step is to press it into position. You can either use a press, pliers, or a hammer die. In the last step, we're going to clean up that top edge with a serger. If you don't have a serger, you can use a zigzag stitch. This will also prevent fraying. With the flat panel complete, we're going to grab our front assembly and place it directly above our pocket. Make sure it doesn't fall below our first set of elastic loops. Flip the right sides together, make sure it's centered, and we're going to stitch the top edge on the inside of our serge. This will be about a 1/4 inch away from the edge. Flip the flap down, and we're going to add a top stitch. This can be pretty bulky, and after stitching, we're going to add the second part of our closure. The easiest way to do this is to see where the top section falls on our pocket and mark it with chalk. After marking, we're going to cut or punch our hole, grab the opposite side of our closure, place the closure in our hole, secure the back on the closure, and press it into position. After pressing, I always like to double check to make sure that everything lines up, and once it's lined up, you can place it off to the side. Grab your front pocket back side zipper panel, open it up. With our 28-inch zipper, we're going to line it up on the bottom side of our panel with the right sides together. And I like to keep it in the center of the zipper, and we're going to stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. This is why I recommend using a longer zipper, so that way you can snip the ends later on. After stitching, we're going to open up the panel and flip the right sides down. From here, we're going to cover up that raw edge using double fold bias tape. And I'm going to walk you through a few different methods. The first method is using a bias tape making kit, and this is where you make your own bias tape. It's super simple to do. You cut your bias tape strips, feed it through your folder, and press it as it's coming out your folder. And by picking this method, you get to choose the size and also the color of fabric to match your project. The second method is using a double fold bias tape binder. You install this to your machine, and it gives you the ability to sew directly onto your garment. It's a very fast and effective technique. The third technique is using pre-made bias tape. This technique, you're very limited to colors, but it's easy to do. You just fold it over your edge and stitch it down. This is a great way to go if you don't have a lot of tools to work with. And I'm going to be stitching mine on using the double fold bias tape attachment. By far, this is one of the best techniques if you're planning on making a lot of bags. We're going to be doing a lot of bias taping with this bag, so definitely find the technique that works best for you. Flip the right sides back up, and we're going to add a top stitch all the way across that top edge. And typically with zippers, you want to try to make them as neat as possible, so I recommend using a thread color that matches your fabric. And it's really that simple to clean up a raw edge on the inside of a bag. Grab your front pocket front side zipper panel, and we're going to place it on the opposite side of the zipper on the top side of your panel. And the best way to make sure it's lined up is using the side edges and the center of the zipper. Once you have both of the panels lined up, we're going to stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I typically always use regular presser foots on zippers, but feel free to use a zipper presser foot. Just like the previous steps, we're going to flip it over to the wrong side and add our bias tape. And you can totally skip the bias taping if you don't want to do it. I just like to add this for a more professional looking bag. Flip the panel open and add your top stitch. Another quick tip is using an edge presser foot for nice straight stitches. That's going to complete your front pocket zipper assembly. You mainly want to make sure your edges are perfectly lined up on a diagonal. Next, we're going to grab our front pocket bottom side panel, open the panel up, grab our zipper assembly. We're going to attach these panels together starting with the side edges. Place the right sides together, making sure the outside edges are lined up with the outside edges of your zipper panel, and we're going to flip it over to the other side and do the exact same thing. Be sure to move the zipper train to the inside of the panel, and once you have this done, we're going to stitch both of the sides at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Be careful going over the zipper, and after stitching, we're going to snip the zipper ends flush with the seam allowance. Just like the previous steps, we're going to continue the process of bias taping all the raw edges. After bias taping, or if you choose to skip that step, we're going to flip to the opposite side, point the seam allowance towards the bottom panel, and add a top stitch. Moving on, cut 4 6-inch strips of your 3/4 inch webbing, grab 4 of your buckles, and we're going to mark out 4 spots on our front assembly. Slide the webbing through the single opening of your buckle. Place the right side on one of your marked out areas with the webbing hanging over about 1/2 inch. Repeat this process for the other 3 buckles, making sure that the opposite side buckles are lined up evenly. Stitch them into position, and I recommend placing them anywhere within the side panel below the top of the flat panel. Grab your complete zipper assembly, mark the centers on the top and the bottom. Do the same for your front assembly, and we're going to line up the top and the bottom centers with the right sides together. Pin the 2 assemblies together, and we're going to stitch all the way around the outside edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And this can be a trickier step because you really want everything to line up correctly, so take your time. Be sure to loosen up the presser foot so the 2 layers stay aligned as you're sewing and they don't bunch up and cause it to go unaligned. And after a stitch like this, I always like to double check to make sure all the layers got stitched together correctly and everything stayed aligned. And from here, we're going to bias tape the inside edge. Moving on, grab our front pocket divider panel, mark the centers on both top and bottom, and we're going to place our front pocket assembly on the right side of our divider. Just like the previous step, we're going to line up the centers on both top and bottom, pin the 2 panels together, and we're going to stitch all the way around the outside edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And this is the same as the previous step. You really want to take your time, make sure the layers are staying aligned as you're sewing. This is going to be the front pocket on your bag, so any little mistakes are going to be very noticeable. Double check the edges, make sure all the layers got stitched together, and from here, we're going to serge all the way around the outside edge. Or if you don't have a serger, you can zigzag stitch. And this step is really to clean up those edges to really neaten it up for future steps. It's a really great way to keep all the layers organized in a neater looking bag. And after serging, we can place it off to the side. Grab our back pocket front zipper panel, and we're going to line the back edge up on our 34-inch or longer zipper with right sides together. Just like the previous steps, use the center as a guideline, and once you have it lined up and pinned down, stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And once you have the panel stitched down, we're going to flip the right sides up, grab our back pocket back zipper panel, place it on the opposite side of zipper on the top edge of the panel. Just like our previous zipper assembly, make sure the side edges are lined up, and this is easily done by lining everything up from the center. Once you have it pinned down, we're going to stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Just like the previous step, we're going to flip to the wrong side and add bias tape to both of the raw edges. After adding bias tape to both of the raw edges, we're going to flip it back over with the right sides up and add top stitching to both of the edges. And this is going to be the top of the bag opening, so you really want to take your time and make sure you keep these stitches nice and neat. After top stitching both sides, you can place this panel off to the side and grab our back pocket bottom side panel. Using the pattern, we're going to mark out our webbing placement guides. After marking, we're going to cut 6 8-inch strips of webbing, place the strips of webbing on our marked out placement guides, making sure the strips on both panel line up with one another. From here, we're going to line out 2-inch marks and use these webbings as loop holders. And feel free to mark them out at different distances depending on how many hooks you want to actually make. Once you're satisfied with the placement, we're going to tack stitch at each one of the marks. And I recommend doing a nice heavy tack stitch because if you're clipping heavy things on, you don't want these to rip out. And lastly, we're going to stitch as close as we can to the outside edge. And this feature is optional. If you want to skip it, you totally can. From here, we're going to grab our back pocket bottom front side panel, grab the bottom panel, and we're going to line the curved edges up with the right sides together. After pinning the edges together, we're going to stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Since both of the panels are curved, it's a little bit awkward, so just take your time and work around the curve. From here, we're going to trim the webbing ends flush with the seam allowance and add bias tape to both of the raw edges. After adding the bias tape, we're going to flip the right sides up, point the seam allowance towards the front panel, and add top stitching to both of those edges. Again, working around that curve can be pretty tricky, so I highly recommend using an edge presser foot or taking your time. With the top stitching complete, we're going to grab our back pocket top bottom panel, make sure the main bottom side panel edge is pointing down, and we're going to line the side edge up with the bottom of the front panel. Place the right sides together and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Flip the right side up, and we're going to do the same thing for the opposite side with the opposite front panel and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Flip the panels to the wrong side and bias tape both of the raw edges. After bias taping, we're going to flip back to the right side, point the seam allowance towards the front panel, and add top stitching to both of those new edges. After completing the top stitch, we're going to grab our zipper assembly, make sure the front edge is pointing towards the inside, and we're going to line up both of the edges similar as the front with the right sides together, flip it around to the opposite side, line up both of the side edges, and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And if you are sewing with the zipper pointing up, I do recommend hopping the zipper and tack stitching on both sides. Snip both of the zipper ends flush with the seam allowance. And just like the previous steps, we're going to add bias tape to both of those raw edges. After adding the bias tape, we're going to flip the right sides back up, point the seam allowance towards the top zipper assembly, and add a top stitch. Same goes for the top stitch. I like to hop over the zipper, add a tack stitch, and keep stitching. And with this top stitch, you can either stitch the top or the bottom. It's totally up to you and whatever preference you like. Flip the right side down and grab your pocket assembly, and we're going to place it on the inside opening. Like the previous steps, mark the centers on the top and bottom, line up the centers, pin everything together, and we're going to stitch all the way around the outside edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And with each one of these layers we add, it does get a little bit trickier because we have to be more precise with each one of the measurements and making sure that each one of these steps we sew correctly. Like always, we're going to do a quick double check, make sure all the layers got stitched together and that everything is lined up correctly. Flip back to the inside and add bias tape to the new raw edge. The bias tape not only covers up the raw edge, but it also adds strength and structure to the overall seam. Flip the right sides back out, flatten out the bottom edge, and grab your back pocket main bottom side panel. With the centers marked on the bottom edge and the panel, we're going to place the right sides together, add a pin exactly in that center, and with this one, we're going to sew from the center to the outside edge. So starting at the center, we're going to sew in one direction, go back to the center, and start sewing in the opposite direction. This is an easy way to keep that panel completely centered and aligned up on the bottom edge. And from here, we're going to add bias tape to that raw edge. After adding the bias tape, we're going to flip the right sides out, face the seam allowance towards the bottom panel, and add a top stitch. Take your time and work with the curve. And that will be the last top stitch of the project. This is going to wrap up the whole entire front assembly. From here, we can move this panel off to the side and grab all 4 of your strap panels. We're going to place the wrong sides together and bias tape the edges. Another way is placing the right sides together, stitching the edges at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and flipping the right sides back out. I do this way in other videos, so check them out in other videos if you'd like to perform that method. But this one we're doing a little bit different. I'm actually going to be placing a very thin piece of foam in between both of the panels. This will give me enough cushion within that strap for heavier loads, at the same time keeping the strap nice and thin. So cut 2 foam inserts out the same size as your panel, sandwich the insert in between the wrong sides of your panels, and lastly, bias tape around the outside edges, leaving the top edge open. I really do like using the bias tape technique on the straps. It makes for an overall really thin, nice looking strap. But like always, feel free to make the straps that work best and look best with your bag. Using the pattern, we're going to mark out the strap adjustment placement, and this is at the bottom of our strap panel. Another bonus feature, we're going to add a buckle going across the strap, so we're going to be using extra hardware, slide a 7-inch piece of webbing through our slide in the one end opening of our buckle, sandwich the webbing at the back, and add a nice heavy duty tack stitch. Feel free to add 1 or 2 tack stitches. Cut an 8 to 12 inch piece of webbing and we're going to slide it through the opposite slide, but we're just going to roll it over and add a tack stitch. Slide the opposite end through the inside opening of the buckle and back out through the outside opening. Once out the opening, we're going to roll the end over twice and add a tack stitch. In the second side webbing strip is really up to you and the size you want to make it, how wide you're going to make the straps, but you can adjust the second webbing strip size later on and you can place this off to the side. Cut two 14-inch strips of webbing, feed one end through the top openings of our strap adjuster, pull it out about 2 inches underneath, and place that on our marked area. On the opposite end of the webbing, we're going to slide on our chest buckle. With the chest buckle on, we're going to roll over the top edge of our webbing. Repeat this process for the opposite strap, making sure both of the strap adjusters are lined up evenly. And from here, we're just going to add a tack stitch to the bottom and the top edges. This is going to give us plenty of room for that center chest buckle to slide up and down for personal comfort. You can place the straps off to the side and grab our bottom side strap panels. Mark the hem fold guides on both of the panels. Cut two 24-inch strips of webbing. Fold the panel at the hem guide. Place the webbing strip in the center on the wrong side of the panel, and we're going to fold the panel in half, sandwiching the webbing in between. Pin all the layers together, and we're going to stitch the outside edges as close as we can to the edge. We're also going to go back and do a few diagonal stitches for extra strength and security on those straps. Repeat this process, and then we're going to slide the opposite webbing end through the bottom section of our strap adjuster. Lastly, we're going to finish off the webbing end by rolling it over twice and adding a tack stitch. And the overall length for the webbing can be adjusted based on personal preference. You can add more or less and really customize this bag to your personal measurements. Moving on, we're going to grab the inside pocket top panel, grab your 12+ inch zipper, place the right sides together, lining up the flat edge of the panel, and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. After stitching, we're going to place the section off to the side and grab our inside bottom pocket panel. Grab the section you just stitched and line up the bottom pocket panel on the opposite side of the zipper. Just like previous steps, we're going to make sure both of the edges are lined up evenly and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Flip open the right sides and we're going to add a top stitch to both of those zipper edges. We are skipping the bias tape, but feel free to add it if you would like. Using the pattern, we're going to mark out the fold guides on our pattern. At the fold guides, we're going to pinch and pull up evenly on both ends. And flip the bottom portion up so the right sides are together. Move the zipper train to the center of the panel, and we're going to stitch both of the side edges at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And if you are stitching with the zipper pointing up, just be cautious, either skip over it or go very slow. After stitching, we're going to snip the zipper ends flush with the seam allowance and add bias tape to both of our side seams. And be sure to leave that top edge opened and unstitched, and we're going to place this pocket off to the side. And grab your main back panel. Using the pattern, we're going to mark out the webbing buckle placement guides on both sides of our main back panel. Cut 4 14-inch strips of webbing, and we're going to place them on our webbing guides, hanging the webbing ends over the panel about a 1/2 inch. Grab your complete strap assembly, line up the top evenly from the center. I like to place them about 1.5 inches to 2 inches from the center, and then we're going to also drape them over the edge about a 1/4 inch. Moving to the bottom, we're going to place the bottom section just before the bottom curve of the corner, making sure both sides are even with one another. Once you have everything pinned into position, flip to the wrong side of the main back panel, grab your inside complete pocket, and we're going to line it up in the center of the top edge. With everything pinned down, we're going to stitch as close as we can to the outside edge, and repeat this process for everything we pinned down, the bottom straps and all of the webbing. And this step makes it 1,000 times easier to sew on the main front panel. Double check to make sure everything is lined up, and from here we're going to grab our main front panel, mark the centers on both of the panels, flip the front panel inside out, and we're going to place the right sides together, lining up the centers on the top and the bottom. Pin both of the layers together, and from here we're going to stitch all the way around the outside edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And just like all of the previous steps, you're going to want to take your time, make sure you keep the layers aligned as you're sewing. And if you don't get it right the first try, you can totally de-thread it and try it again. Just like anything, sewing does take practice, and once you get done sewing, trim all of the webbing flush with the seam allowance. Same goes for the top of the straps. With the entire edge cleaned up, the last thing we're going to do is add our bias tape. With our final bias tape added to the inside edge, we're going to do one last look over and flip the right sides out. With the right sides out, we're going to do one last look over on front and back, make sure everything is lined up, and from here we're going to grab our back webbing ends and feed them through our front buckles. Go ahead and do this for all of the webbing straps. With the strap ends through, we're going to finish off the ends by rolling over twice and tack stitching. I did make these straps a little bit big so you can personalize them, cut them to your exact size, or leave them exactly as they are. Next, we're going to grab our elastic cord. I'm using 3/16, cut about a yard to start, and feed the ends through the bottom side of our bottom D-ring. To each midsection, I'm going to add a ring. This is optional. Feed your elastic through the ring and back up through the D-ring. Repeat this process for the opposite side. Add another ring and feed it through our last D-ring. And lastly, repeat this process for the opposite side. Grab your cord stopper and feed both of your ends through the cord stopper. Cinch the cord stopper down close to the bag, and I'm going to trim up some of the elastic, but feel free to keep as much as you would like. I'm going to finish off the elastic ends by adding hooks, and these are easily added by sliding the hooks onto the end and clipping them in place. And overall, I think these hooks add way more functionality to our elastic cord. I like to clip the hooks back onto the elastic, and if you ever had to pull the elastic off and change it, you just take the hooks off and you're good to go. And don't forget, this huge bag can collapse down to 8.5 by 10 inches by flipping the inside pocket right side out. Just like that, you have a small little bag you can throw in another bag, or just throw it in a cart or somewhere for nice storage.
And there you have it, your 40-liter hiking backpack is complete. Thank you so much for watching and supporting the channel. I know this was a little bit harder and a longer project, but I've been wanting to do one of these for a while. And this is a nice base template. You can add so many more features onto this bag. And if you do add more features, definitely tag me on Instagram. I'd love to see what you come up with. And like always, I'm gonna keep the videos coming at you, so I'll see you next time.